Hey, folks, we're back, and welcome to Unfinished Business Deep Dive. This week, we're going to the 80s. Why not? We've been talking about Nicolas Cage recently, but he has nothing to do with this episode. So, we are going to go back to 1986 when there were still movie stars who were iconic. And we're going to talk about The Golden Child, starring Mr. Eddie Box Office Murphy. And this was kind of a different change of pace for him, whereas this was more of a supernatural adventure film that had comedic moments versus, his usual just straight up comedy. The film was originally written to actually be more adventure driven. And they first went to Mel Gibson, who turned it down. And then they went to Eddie Murphy and rewrote it a little bit for his more comedic beats. And this is a story of a private detective who somehow gets involved in a missing person case of a young Tibetan child. And he has been chosen to be, this is corny, he was chosen to be the chosen one to not only retrieve this child, but protect this child from the evil forces at bay, played by Charles Dance in one of the first films I've ever seen him in. This was directed by Michael Ritchie, written by Dennis Feldman. It is not surprisingly my pick of a deep dive, but Andre's pick for a deep dive. Andre, explain why you chose this film.
I chose The Golden Child for one reason and one reason only, because it was the very first Eddie Murphy movie that I ever saw as a kid. I hadn't seen Beverly Hills Cop. I hadn't seen Coming to America. This was the first one because my parents had gotten cable around 87, 88, and this movie was on all the time. And I used to be scared shitless at the end when he fights Charles Dance, who's now like a demon with wings and has to stop him with the Ajanti dagger. I mean, as scary as that was, I mean, I was also like excited by that because it was the era of Ghostbusters and Indiana Jones. So that was really like my first taste. I didn't know Eddie Murphy was like an R-rated comedian, not until much later. So this was really like my introduction to him. And apparently this could have been his Indiana Jones franchise because at the time, Beverly Hills Cop was such a huge hit that Paramount threw scripts left and right to his door, and he wouldn't do anything that resembled like an Axel Foley type character. He wanted to branch out. He even passed up Star Trek 4 because his character, like he wanted to be like a Klingon or he wanted to be like a member of the fleet, but instead they were going to make him like an astrophysicist who chases the Enterprise crew because he thinks they're aliens. And then it's basically him just doing all his jokes. It would have turned into Superman 3 if they had gone that route. So this script, which was originally called The Rose of Tibet, it was supposed to be like a Raymond Chandler type of detective film. And as you said, it was intended for somebody like Mel Gibson. But then the studio it was one of the scripts they gave to Eddie, and he thought this could be his Indiana Jones franchise because of all the creatures and mystical arts and all these things that go on that he saw like, hey, I turned down Ghostbusters and I was a fucking idiot for that. This is how I'm going to make up for this. I'm going to do this movie and become, like the next Indiana Jones. But instead, they take a private eye character and they make him a social worker with a gun. And that, I was always confused with that. I always thought he was a private eye. No, he was a social worker the whole time, yet you never see him do any social working other than finding a missing girl who ends up dead. So that was always like the weirdest thing, but that's one of the things about this movie that just is so odd. So this was the same time as Big Trouble in Little China, which that the tone of that film was very consistent all across the board. It is not intended to be taken seriously, but yet it embraces, the culture of, Asian mystical arts. But this is a film that Eddie was so high on himself, he thought he could get a Steven Spielberg or Scorsese or George Miller. He even considered Clint Eastwood to direct this movie, but he goes with Michael Ritchie, who had done Fletch and Bad News Bears. He had a diverse career, but he was hardly the guy to do a big blockbuster like this. And what you got was a movie that it looked as if it was shot to be a serious action adventure film, but then the studio looked at it and said, we want more Axel Foley type stuff. So you start having like those scenes with him in the airport doing the Viva Nepal moment, or the jokes he does around Charles Dance, or a big fantasy scene he has when he's trying to rescue Charlotte Lewis. I mean, that's the stuff where it's like, it doesn't know what it wants to be. Does it want to be a kid's movie, or does it want to try to be like a typical Eddie Murphy project? And that's where, as much as I still have that nostalgia for it, and I think he still holds the movie together, it's all those other elements that make it dated and his least memorable film of that period.
Well, okay, with this film, it's interesting you mentioned George Miller, because that was somebody he actually went to, and George Miller turned down the film only because Eddie Murphy made him wait 4 hours for a meeting before he showed up. So he was like, F this, I'm not going to make this. And John Carpenter was actually offered this film, but chose to make A Big Trouble in Little China instead. Michael Ritchie, to me, is one of those underused journeyman directors, because he's had a long career and he's made plenty of great movies. He was an odd choice considering the material. If this had been a comedy from the beginning, he would be more understandable why they chose him. But again, with all the special effects and fantasy elements, it is a rather odd choice. And this was actually Eddie Murphy's first PG-13 movie, even though there's loads of course language. And it would be a long time before he ever made another PG-13 movie. You mentioned that they made them reshoot a bunch of comedic scenes for the film, because just the scene in the airport with Brother Noopsy, that obviously is just this is straight up comedic improv. I cannot imagine this was in the script, and he does something to convince them not to arrest him. I really didn't see Charles Dance in another movie until The Last Action Movie.
Yeah, same here.
So I was but he always stayed as one of those memorable villains, because he's a good actor, but he's still a rather odd choice for the role in this movie. Everything's supposed to be Tibetan. He's really the only white male character in it. So maybe that was supposed to be representative, black, well, as you said, social worker versus British white aristocrat.
Well, it's going to be crazier, because in the original script, he was going to be a man with a rat head who smoked a lot.
Yeah, that's the one element I'm glad they dropped. I would have been what is this, a Muppet? Jim Henson production?
It'd have been Labyrinth.
And nobody notices. You have Eric Douglas, Michael Douglas's brother, who has a small role as one of the bikers. I did not know Charlotte Lewis was only 18 when this movie was made.
Oh God, she is gorgeous.
She is, but if I had known she was 18 when they made the movie, I would have been yeah, this, even though Eddie wasn't that old, it still would have been this is kind of strange.
Well, they did date during the film, and I think they got pretty close, because she had lost her father, who was a policeman in Europe, and they grew pretty close. Of course, it didn't last very long, but yeah, there was a thing going on there. And they had a love scene that supposedly was cut, and it was one of the reasons he was so pissed off with the film.
I'm sure he was. But one of the weird things about this movie is he handles himself well in the action sequence against the bikers. But then, like I said, how come he's kick ass there? But then strangely, when there are other scenes in the movie, he sort of becomes super wussy.
Yeah.
Where it's oh, now everything's gonna be comedic. I want the knife, please. Really?
Well, that's one of the problems with the movie too, is that you look at Big Trouble in Little China, there's a lot of exciting action scenes in there, especially that whole third act, all the martial arts that they were doing. It reminded you of the Troy Hark movies in Hong Kong. But here, everything feels like it's shot in a studio, and it's just small scale. This movie, it had a big budget with all the ILM effects, some of which look good for the time, and some stuff the Snake Lady looks horrible, but scary for that time.
Yeah, scary.
but they definitely needed not only like an action director to do it, like a George Miller type, but they needed like a real Hong Kong choreographer. This was way before like The Matrix and, you know, all the films where they would hire like a Corey Yun or, you know, these guys that now do like those really crazy martial arts scenes in today's movies. They weren't doing that in the 80s because everything was still like very old school and Clint Eastwood, Charles Bronson type stuff. And maybe Chuck Norris was the only other guy doing it, but that was it. You didn't really have like martial arts done well in a film other than Big Trouble in Little China and The Karate Kid, but even that was like very low scale.
Well, yeah, because you have Randall Tex Cobb in here as a Mongolian.
Yeah.
And it's like, really? And then realistically, the only real action sequence to me, or there's two action sequences that are memorable. One is the dream action sequence he has. And the other one is when he's trying to get the knife going across all those like tent poles. That's the only scene where I felt like they really did action and comedy well, you know, serving each other in that scene. But other than that, unfortunately, the way it was shot, it does feel like one of those like Richard Chamberlain, Chuck Norris, Firewalker type movies that
Yeah.
Channel 11 played all day. It was just like a choose your own adventure. We'll throw this actor in there and give him this outlandish story. And instead of usually the black sidekick, instead the black guy is the lead here, you know? And that's what it feels like watching this film. Like you, I'm nostalgic for this movie because I actually saw it in theaters as well, I think I was like 8 when it came out. So I saw this in theater. So that's why it still, you know, holds a place in my heart. Maybe it was also because as a child watching kind of an adult adventure tale really, you know, was like something that was like huge to me, especially when you have a black lead. So it was like, wow, you know, I've never seen this before. But I would say the scariest thing to me, other than when Charles Dance transforms, was the oatmeal with the blood when they reveal that there's blood in it. I was like, what the
that was
hell
pretty
is
intense
that?
for the time.
Exactly. And always trying to figure out what the hell that other dude was, who was the other Mongolian who had all that swinging weapon. Like, what was wrong with his character? Was he like just simple, but knew how to use a weapon? And
But this is where, again, the tone of this movie is like, it doesn't know what it wants to be. Because like some of the sound effects, like when she's going, like Charlie Lewis is going like back and forth, jumping off ledges, they have like these cartoon sound effects going on. And then the bit where the child, the story in itself is not deep. It's pretty simplistic. There's no like real depth to like why Eddie's the chosen one or why this kid is so important that if he dies, then the whole world is destroyed. But like even the stuff that he does, like he heals a bird, which is nice. He does the thing with the Pepsi can, which is like a really cool stop motion effect. But what does it serve for the film other than to say, oh yeah, this kid's got powers and can like bring the dead back to life? It's just, I don't understand all that. It feels like it had maybe something more going on before the script got changed to be an Eddie Murphy vehicle. And that's where, you know, if they had that depth, like a Raiders of the Lost Ark type of script, it probably would have been his other franchise, like his multi-million-dollar franchise, instead of Beverly Hills Cop or The Nutty Professor. You know, that's why I think even then the music too, you know, which this was the other problem that he was having at that time. So they hired John Barry originally to do the score. He did like a beautiful James Bond sounding score with a little jazz element. And then they took it out because it just didn't fit the movie. So they went with Michelle Colombier, who did the music for Purple Rain, to do more like a Harold Faltermeyer type of score, which I like personally. But it's just you're making another Eddie Murphy movie. You're not giving him any real depth. You're not giving him a chance to grow. And that's the issue he had, where after this film, he just wrote his own stuff. He didn't bother to go and do any of the scripts that Paramount had given him because of the fact that all the material was tepid. And, you know, that resulted in a lot of projects that, quite honestly, was like they didn't want him to stretch. And that, I think, stinted his growth as an actor.
I agree. But I mean, it also, I think he wanted a little more. I think after this project, he realized he wanted a little more control of his project. So that might have been another reason why. Because I know that John Williams supposedly was called in to do a score that they never
Yeah,
used.
he was offered. And Alan
And
Silvestri.
yeah, that was, I believe, their first choice for this.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I have a nostalgic like of this movie. I wouldn't say like, oh, it's a great movie, but I'll say like it's memorable, for many different reasons. And I also like that half the cast was also in Big Trouble in Little China.
Yeah.
So I'm like, wow, it was like two fantasy films. One was really good. One was kind of like average to below average. I know once he had made Coming to America and was doing interviews for that, he really trashed this movie, and it's a shame because it still means something to some people, maybe people more my age who grew up with it rather than, people going through the career of Eddie Murphy, because this is where they're like, really? And, I'm trying to think any other trivia about this film.
Well, I know the
Um,
writer, like the writer of the movie, he had no problem with Eddie in the role. He had more issues with Michael Ritchie. He just thought he was the wrong guy for the job. And I agree. I think any of the other choices, especially like George Miller, would have been a far better director for this type of picture.
well, I always want to see anything George Miller makes other than a Mad Max
Yeah.
movie, to see him stretch. And so far, we've got Lorenzo's Oil. So, he's made other films, but still, that's like the closest to memorable that he got outside of the Mad Max movie. Well, you have Frank Welker, who does the voice of the
Yeah.
demon, who also was Dr. Claw and
Use the
Inspector Gadget.
dagger.
And Dark Side and Super Friends. Um, like I said, I have no problem with this movie, but yeah, again, it's a movie where you can tell the studio came in and wanted more comedy. And it feels like a missed opportunity, like you said, for the range of Eddie Murphy, because you can understand why he chose the film. And he said, even he said the original script was better, but they changed it all around and wanted to make it more comedic instead of letting him stretch. Whereas I feel like, let's say Eddie Murphy was a major comedian, not the legendary star, but an up and coming comedic star now. I feel like they would have given him maybe a little more pull and let him, show range a little bit more. And a studio would jump at this movie because it's a chance for a franchise and tons of special effects. But unfortunately, at the time, it was like, they treated it like it was the latest Eddie Murphy comedy when it was something that could have been very special at the time. And they let it fall through the cracks. Hell, maybe if not Ted Danson, if Jim Henson had directed this, this would have been even better.
Oh yeah, he would have done a bang up job here.
And it truly would have been PG-13 because Eddie Murphy wouldn't be able to use half the language, and I would hope I wouldn't have seen an oatmeal of blood.
But
Though it
that's
was
the thing.
effective,
He would have made the dark elements work and still make it family friendly.
and that's well. But then, would we get as much Charlotte Lewis?
Oh, I don't mind at all. I mean, the more Charlotte Lewis, the better, for as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but she wouldn't have been able to be as sexy as she is in the film. The wet
Yeah, you
t-shirt.
couldn't get her in a wet t-shirt. No, I don't think that would have happened.
Exactly. But Charlotte Lewis is always an actress who I wish had more work and in substantial films, and because she was like world-class beauty at that
Oh
time. She
God.
still is quite beautiful, and her and Tia Carrere should have had longer careers. And
And I thought it was cool, even though Eddie was never happy with the movie. Like when Dolomite came out, he had that little reunion at Sundance with the young girl who played the boy. Like that's
oh
the other
yeah,
because
I forgot to
everybody
mention
thought
that.
for years that the golden child was this young
A
boy.
boy.
It was actually a girl who was bald. JL Reed, and looks way different now than she did back then.
Oh, so she looks like a girl now.
Yeah, she looks like a girl who's a mom.
Well, I mean, God, that movie's. I gotta keep in mind that movie is that old, man.
Just out of
Um,
curiosity, after you saw the movie, did you want to get the hat that he had?
no, sorry, it didn't have the Indiana. Actually, it didn't happen after the movie. I would say maybe years later, like in the early 90s, when everybody was starting to wear hats like that.
Yeah.
I wanted that because I knew I still did not want a leather one.
No.
But I wanted a hat. Shoot, I want a hat like that now. So, I mean, I thought that was cool. I know I did not want a leather jacket like that, though.
I
That
had a
he
similar
wore.
jacket, but it doesn't fit me anymore.
See, I never wanted the jacket. Though, if I was going to get a gun, right now, maybe I'd get his little small compact 6-shooter that he had in that movie.
It kind of gave him a Shaft vibe, and that was the thing. Like I said, he's a social worker that doesn't connect.
Well, he is working out of Los Angeles, so maybe it was like, in the 80s, it's like, hey, I'm going into a biker place. I ain't going empty-handed.
I'll put it this way: it's not Chains of Gold with John Travolta, where he's a social worker trying to save Joey Lawrence, playing a Hispanic kid, and fighting off drug dealers, played by Benjamin Bratt.
Did John Travolta go bare fist in that movie?
He did. He actually did, and he killed the guy with a crocodile.
I'm like, just for that sentence alone, it's a must see. He killed a guy with a crocodile. I'm like, see, Eddie, you weren't as tough as John Travolta in a TV movie. So, but like I said, I still have I have problems with it, but I'd say it's definitely watchable. It's one of those things I wish modern audiences, like younger audiences, would discover, just for the fascination of the what the hell type of factor watching the film. And
I would go more than say that I would recommend it, because I would recommend other Eddie Murphy movies before this. I would recommend Trading Places and 48 Hours, Beverly Hills Cop, all the classics. I would go as far as to say, if I was a big enough director in Hollywood, I would remake the movie myself.
Oh, it would definitely be drastically different.
Yeah, I would go back to what it was intended to be. I would still have a black lead, but I would make the fantasy elements more serious than what they did.
You never know. There's still time. Is there anything else you want to say about The Golden Child?
I know they put out a Blu-ray with some special features. There's no new interviews with Eddie, but mostly with some of the crew members that are still around. So I'd be curious to want to see that. That's all I got to say about the film.
Okay, well, that is the end of The Golden Child deep dive, and we've said what we thought. Definitely go out there and check it out yourself. Let us know what you think, or if there's something we missed or some unknown trivia, please let us know. And that is the end of this episode of Unfinished Business Deep Dive. Until next time.
Every 1,000 generations, a perfect child is born. A child with magical powers. A child sent to bring good into the world. A golden child. And now this child has been kidnapped by the forces of evil. As foretold by the Nichung Oracle, only one man can find him. Only one man can rescue him. He is a man from the City of Angels. He is a man who does what is right. A brave man, a true man. It is his destiny to save the Golden Child. He is the Chosen One.
If I'm the Chosen One, how come I'm freezing while you're sitting in a warm movie theater? I'm going back to LA and kicking somebody's behind. This isn't supposed to be happening to me. Chosen One, my behind.
Why couldn't somebody choose me to go to the Bahamas? Hawaii is nice. You could have sent me to Vegas. The Chosen One.